Squad.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes a Spider-Man.
Hello there. Today I'm going to be doing a response video. Something that, while not entirely new to my channel, is not something I have done in a while. And so, I want to do it right. To that end, here are some disclaimers. 1. A lot of this is just opinion, both the videos I'm responding to and the video you're watching. I fully respect and would fight for the right for both of us to have an opinion about a Spider-Man movie. My criticisms are not rooted in the fact that we disagree. 2. This is not a personal attack. While I may criticize the actions of Alex, aka HiTop Films, in this video, none of it is towards his character. I have nothing against him as a person. I haven't even really interacted with him in any way. So, while I technically don't hold any responsibility for anyone attacking him over this video, I would strongly encourage you to not do that. It is completely counterproductive, and it really says more about you than it does about Alex. Now, with that out of the way, let's actually get to the meat of this spider ham sandwich. I don't know. HiTop Films is a YouTube channel with over 350,000 subscribers that is run by a guy named Alex. The content focuses mostly on comic book characters and movies, particularly Spider-Man and Batman and their respective mythos. While the most popular video on the channel revolves around Batman, perhaps the most infamous video on his channel revolves around Spider-Man. Or to be more specific, MCU Spider-Man. Spider-Man Homecoming is a bad Spider-Man movie, and its subsequent sequels, Spider-Man Far From Home broke my heart, and Spider-Man No Way Home kinda fixed MCU Spider-Man. This trifecta of film critiques has, as one would imagine, received quite a bit of pushback from the wider YouTube community. For one thing, it's a fairly unpopular opinion, and one that I happen to disagree with. However, that is not my main concern. I personally believe that there are some critical flaws in how HiTop Alex approaches his criticism of these movies, and it's my hope that an analysis of those flaws can better both mine and Alex's content, and serve as a kind of tutorial on what not to do when criticizing something. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a closer look at the first in the trilogy which kicked this whole ordeal off. This video is actually a fairly tame start compared to the other two, and is actually pretty balanced, despite there still being some issues and a couple of bizarre, out-of-the-blue type moments. Starting with the good, one of the first things that HiTop does in this video is point out that he is biased.
So take this video as an opinion, not a fact. And yes, video essays can be opinions. How many flippant argument essays have you written in school? Essays can be biased, and yes, I am biased.
Self-awareness is always a good first step to actual change. He also does talk about things that he likes in the movie, making sure that his criticism is about one key factor of the movie, as the title implies, and not about the movie itself. Of course, you can criticize a movie holistically. That's something I've done before, so me saying you couldn't would be very hypocritical. But if you do present your video as a critique of one specific issue, it does help to stick to that issue. I'm mentioning all this because while this is a very good start for HiTop, it kind of starts to go downhill from here.
In this movie, Peter makes a plethora of mistakes. He indirectly destroys the sandwich shop in Queens and no one dies, not even the cat. He seemingly doesn't feel guilty that he destroyed this man's livelihood. Everything's fine. Compare the humorous lack of consequences in Homecoming to the humorous abundance of consequences in Spider-Man 2.
Okay, great start here. So what Alex is arguing here is that Tom Holland's Peter Parker doesn't face any real consequences, and as a comparison brings out Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker from Spider-Man 2. There are a couple of issues with this. Ignoring the Tobey Maguire comparison for a moment, Peter Parker in this movie does absolutely face consequences.
He indirectly destroys the sandwich shop in Queens and no one dies, not even the cat.
Well, I mean, the store being destroyed is in of itself a consequence. Just because we don't get an extended scene of the cat dying horribly and like seeing all the ramifications of this guy's business getting burned down doesn't mean that the consequences aren't there or aren't implied.
You could argue that Liz leaving Midtown is a consequence, but the movie makes it abundantly clear that Peter really only likes her because she's pretty and smart. He doesn't even know her. He knows pretty much nothing about her. She's just his first crush, which works great in keeping the light high schooler tone, but Liz and her relationship to Peter carries almost no emotional weight.
Well, I mean, maybe it's because Alex hasn't been in high school for a while, I assume, but this does seem a tad tone deaf. Sure, Liz is a high school crush, but a high school crush is a big deal to a high school student, especially an underclassman, which Peter is in this movie. I am getting a little bit off topic, so let's pivot back to the conversation. A huge part of this movie is that Peter gets his suit taken away from him directly because of his own reckless actions. To be fair, that specifically is not a universe consequence, it's an actual authority, being Tony Stark, imposing that consequence on him. But Peter's decision afterwards to still do hero work in a crap suit and nearly getting crushed by a building and almost dying multiple times while fighting the Vulture and getting threatened and, being on a jet high up in the air with practically no protection, all in the pursuit of stopping the Vulture and being a hero, those are consequences. Those are real things that impact his life negatively, even if it's in a shorter amount of time. But it does lead to lasting consequences. Like I said, his crush moves away, which is a big deal to him. So what does HiTop have to say about that?
All that being said, it is important to acknowledge that Peter does indeed face one real big consequence when he loses the suit by trying to do the right thing. Which leads me to the second big reason why Homecoming is a bad Spider-Man movie: the suit.
So, you do acknowledge it, but somehow it doesn't contradict your argument? Okay. The other piece of it that I want to directly tackle is that he compares this lack of consequences to Spider-Man 2. Now, disregarding that Spider-Man 2 is a sequel, and thus would raise the stakes higher than the first movie, which is what Homecoming is in this metaphor. Even if he tried to make the argument comparing Homecoming to the first Raimi movie, there are still problems with that comparison. True, in Spider-Man 1, Peter's uncle gets killed by the thief that he lets get away, and arguably, he gets Norman Osborn, the father of his best friend, killed. I say arguably because do you really think that a man dressed in a green Power Ranger suit flying around New York City and terrorizing the populace would have lasted that long even if he had super strength? He's not impervious to stab wounds, clearly. But those are all young adult consequences, and Tom Spider-Man is not an adult yet. He faces consequences for his actions in this movie that are similar, but I will give you that it is toned down a little bit for the age demographic. Meanwhile, though, it is carrying much of the same messages. It's fair to not like those changes, obviously. I'm not saying you can't like those. What I'm just doing is pointing out the clear filmmaker intent with those changes and questioning why they make this movie a bad Spider-Man movie. Now, those do seem to be his main critiques of Homecoming, and they are critiques that will come up in later videos. So we'll revisit those big criticisms later, and in the meantime, let's talk about some of the other minor criticisms he had of Homecoming that I wanted to talk about. He doesn't like the AI in Peter's suit.
Spider-Man should not have an AI that he can talk to. Yes, I do understand the point of the AI is so that Peter can talk to someone to give away his expositional thoughts. Almost like the thought bubbles in comics, but there's so many better ways to give Peter introspective moments like this.
Can I tell Liz that I'm Spider-Man?
There's so many better ways to give your protagonist an introspective moment without taking away what makes the protagonist the protagonist.
I mean, I don't know. I personally kind of liked Karen in this movie. I thought it was an interesting way to get Peter's thoughts out, but I do understand that it's not to everybody's taste, and it may be a bit more reminiscent of Iron Man than people would have hoped. But it is a small thing, so I won't spend any more time on it. He also dislikes that the movie is connected to the MCU. In fact, it's listed as one of his 3 main complaints, despite him spending nowhere near as much time on it as he does the other 2.
I want you to remember the days where these superhero flicks weren't all connected, where a movie was just a movie. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man is just a movie about Spider-Man. No sequel setup, no character pop-ins, no timeline continuity. It's just a film.
This is the only one that genuinely kind of baffles me. He doesn't really explain himself much beyond saying, it's too connected, and then going off to dismiss some potential counter-arguments. I do have a theory as to what his actual complaint is, but we'll swing back to that later. But yeah, that was HiTop's Homecoming video. There were some half-baked criticisms and a couple of head-scratching moments, but nothing too crazy. It's funny to me that this is the one that sparked off the meme of X thing is a bad Spider-Man movie, but at the end of the day, it's relatively inoffensive as a video. The same cannot be said about the sequel. I'm going to be 100% honest here. This video is why I wanted to make this video in the first place. This video is the reason that I'm a former fan of HiTop films, because it was what made me seriously reevaluate him as a film critic, and eventually led to my decision to stop following him. And if you think I'm being a bit overdramatic, you have not seen this video. Okay, just watch.
It's 3:35 a.m. I just watched Spider-Man Far From Home, and I feel sick. Imagine living, breathing, and eating two things. And then imagine seeing something that makes you not like those two things, makes you not want to care about those two things. Spider-Man Far From Home was a theater experience I genuinely wish to forget. I never thought Spider-Man would become this. I never thought I would see a Spider-Man movie that made me feel this empty.
Oof, and I thought I was the theater kid. But if you haven't seen the movie in question, that being Spider-Man Far From Home, first off, what the heck are you doing here? Did you not see the spoiler warning? And secondly, you may be thinking, well, he may be being dramatic, but perhaps he's playing it up. He is a filmmaker after all, and his feelings can't be completely misguided, so he must have some valid complaints, right? Well... Again, I will give credit where credit is due. Alex does acknowledge his own bias again.
And to be honest, I'm getting tired of it all. All the hate, all the arguing about a fictional character that's supposed to bring people together. I don't need to give you the whole speech. You know this is an opinion piece. I encourage you to go see the movie and make your own opinion piece. You could love something that I hate. I could love something that you hate. You know the drill. Art is subjective.
Sort of, but it doesn't excuse him from the sins he commits in this review. Ding. I do want to get to his main points, but first let's take a look at a couple of the little things that I think are very telling about how Alex watched this movie. For those of you who don't know, the opening of Far From Home is a memorial sequence for the Avengers who died in Avengers Endgame and Infinity War, one that is intentionally badly edited and unprofessional, since it was meant to have been made by students at Peter's high school. After the emotional roller coaster of Endgame, this sequence is meant to be some tension release, helping ease the audience into a somewhat lighter tone. Perhaps it can be read as somewhat out of taste, but it's ultimately harmless, right? Well, let's look at how HiTop reads it.
Spider-Man Far From Home takes everything that worked about Endgame, every heartbreaking moment, and turns it into a joke within the first 2 minutes of the film. I looked over to my friend while I Will Always Love You was playing over goofy headshots of the dead Avengers, the dead heroes, while they were making a meme of the dead heroes, and his jaw had dropped to the floor. Right off the bat, how am I supposed to be invested in this Peter Parker's grief if the film is so focused on making fun of that grief?
Yeah, I'll take the worst possible interpretations of a scene ever for a 500, Alex. Having such an incredibly uncharitable interpretation of the opening 5 minutes of this movie kind of shows you what we're dealing with here. I don't know what happened in between this video and the Homecoming one, but something changed, and it's not a pretty sight. And his actual main points are not much better. His first big one is that Peter in this movie doesn't face any relatable problems and doesn't grow as a character.
This Peter doesn't grow. He doesn't really change. So his final swing feels so soulless to me. I'm sick of a Peter Parker without problems, without relatable problems, and without lasting consequences for those unrelatable issues he faces.
This is interesting to me because Peter's whole deal in this movie is A, dealing with the grief of Tony Stark's death, and B, the self-doubt and fear about the expectations falling on him as Tony's protege. In my personal opinion, grief and self-doubt are incredibly relatable, especially as a young person who's transitioning into adulthood.
How can Peter Parker afford to go on this trip? I don't know. Maybe it's paid for by the school. Perfect opportunity to have Peter have some relatable money problems, but nope, it's too fun for that.
Alex, Peter, a teenage boy, breaks down in tears in this movie because of his grief and his feelings of inadequacy. Just because the film does not cover the problems that you wanted to cover does not mean the film is too fun for serious problems. And as for the whole Peter doesn't grow argument, it's just objectively untrue because that's not how movies work. Peter starts out as a kid who doesn't know what he wants or how to deal with the pressure that's on him, who purposefully attempts to take a break from his responsibility as Spider-Man by hanging up on Nick Fury and trying to leave his spider suit at home on his trip to Europe. And he gives Edith to Quentin Beck. After his talk with Happy, he's able to confront his feelings of doubt and guilt after a reminder that his idol, Tony Stark, who is also a flawed hero, doubted himself.
Peter Parker in this film is told to step up and be the next Iron Man, and then he's told that he just needs to be the next Spider-Man. He just needs to be himself, which is pretty much what he learned in Homecoming, but then they blast AC/DC as Peter is making his new high-tech suit looking just like Tony Stark did. If his arc is supposed to be your own man, then stick with that. Don't tell us one thing and show us another.
The movie isn't saying that though. The whole "don't be Iron Man" thing is something that you made up. And that scene isn't about Peter being Iron Man. It's about him using the tools that Tony gave him to make his own unique suit, similar to how he's using the base that Tony gave him in the previous movie in Civil War as a basis to build his own identity as a hero. Symbolism. The last big complaint that HiTop has about Far From Home is that, supposedly, again, Peter doesn't face any consequences.
Once again, the lasting consequences for this version of Peter Parker are almost non-existent.
Spider-Man's name is Peter Parker.
Yeah, about that. This point is related to the other two, so I won't rehash a lot of this stuff, but I will swing back to the ending. Or, well, endings.
Peter is betrayed, beat up, his friends almost die, and Mysterio is dead. But seconds after all this trauma, Peter is smiling because he kissed the girl and saved the day. Nothing is learned. No lasting impact. No emotional weight.
Okay, first off, second off, that's not the whole ending. You're missing the scene previous to this, where through acting, you can see how this whole emotional turmoil with Beck has taken its toll on him. And also, why shouldn't he be happy? Historically, relief after a stressful situation combined with getting with someone who you've wanted to be in a relationship with for a while is generally a positive emotion. Since humans are complex creatures that can feel many things at once, obviously HiTop isn't suggesting that Peter can't have two emotions at once.
Meanwhile,
He's grieving, but he wants to fall in love and go on vacation. Those things don't mix. They don't. I'm sorry, but it's not real to me. It doesn't work for me.
Guess I spoke too soon there. I already showed the mid-credits scene where Peter gets his identity revealed, and I feel like that speaks for itself in terms of consequences, but HiTop has a response for it, too.
Because seconds later, the entire world now knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Any chance of his identity crisis becoming an issue, all the stories and all the drama that comes from him having to hide half of himself, is tossed away. If I were an optimistic man, I would say that they could tell some pretty dramatic and cool stories about the entire world knowing he's Spider-Man. It's a very different direction for this classic character, a direction that could be interesting and provide real lasting consequences. But knowing how the MCU has treated Peter, it will probably be brushed off and somehow turned into a running joke.
Well, that aged poorly, didn't it? But you see, instead of acknowledging that this fact of the movie directly opposes his point, he simply deflects and speculates that it doesn't count because it will supposedly be turned into a joke based on nothing, really. This is like if you were caught standing over a freshly dead corpse and your defense was, well, yeah, he may have been stabbed within the last 5 minutes, and yeah, I may be holding a bloody knife. But in the future, I will be found not guilty in a court of law, so by extension, I'm not guilty now. Speculating wildly about what the consequences are going to be does not change the flawed conclusion that you have made now. Anyway, those were his big points, but there were a lot of offhanded comments that he made that bugged me quite a bit. So I'm derailing the format of this video temporarily and doing a lightning round.
Uncle Ben's suitcase is in this film and serves as the only reminder that Ben existed, and it ends up getting destroyed at some point off screen. And Peter doesn't give a single shit. Peter Parker doesn't give a single shit about losing something of his uncle's. Which makes me assume that Ben was someone in this universe who didn't really matter all that much to Peter. Great. Cool. That makes perfect sense.
This is a different interpretation of Spider-Man that doesn't necessarily need Uncle Ben explicitly. The movie has it covered with Tony and, in the future, Aunt May. This isn't an actual critique, this is just pointing out a change that you don't like.
Peter Parker in this film all of a sudden has a crush on MJ after paying no attention to her in Homecoming. I guess he came back from the dead, witnessed the death of his idol, and now he wants to get romantic with a girl he barely knows and go on a vacation. This is Mary Jane we are talking about, or Michelle Jones. Either way, she is the love of Peter Parker's life, and I will never forgive this film for not caring enough to develop it. Sure, it's cute, it's awkward. Zendaya and Tom Holland have some very nice chemistry, but that's all there is to it.
While I agree with you that their relationship could have been established way better in previous movies and that it does feel a bit off in this movie, what you're asking for is a deep and developed adult relationship between two teenagers who just started dating. I don't think I need to elaborate further on that point.
But Mysterio's motivation, like Vulture's, has nothing to do with Peter. There are no personal stakes. They try to make me care about his relationship to Peter, but spend no time developing it. Holland and Gyllenhaal have some really nice chemistry, but that can only get you so far. Quentin Beck's motivation is all about Tony, and that's just, dare I say it, lazy?
Okay. So I've heard this criticism of the MCU Spider-Man before, so let me lay out my argument here. In the context of these movies, Peter's not well established within the universe. Tony Stark, on the other hand, is. Beck starts out motivated by Tony. But once Beck knows who Peter is and Peter starts getting in his way, he starts hating him like he did Tony Stark. And he emotionally torments him in one of the best scenes in the entire MCU. And, oh yeah, he doxes Peter to the entire world. Peter, an actual child. May I remind you, in Spider-Man 2, a movie that Alex has a 45-minute video praising, Doc Ock's motivation had absolutely nothing to do with Peter, until he, as Spider-Man, got involved in his scheme. Sure, he knew Peter before, but it wasn't much more of a connection than what Beck forms with Peter prior to their conflict in this movie. Speaking of Beck,
Gyllenhaal does the best and has a lot of fun with what he's given, but he's given so little. It's not like it's a surprise that he's the bad guy. Everybody who has picked up a Spider-Man comic or seen a Spider-Man flick knows that he's going to go bad at some point. So if I'm not connected to him, if I can't see his point and I can't feel his connection to Peter, then why am I supposed to care? Because he got fucked over by Tony Stark?
yeah, HiTop. You're not supposed to empathize with Beck. His motive isn't meant to make us sympathize with him, it's meant to make sense to us that it makes sense to him, because he's crazy. Sometimes villains are just bad, even if they do have layers. Beck's still interesting because of how he interacts with other people and their characters, but he doesn't have to have a relatable motive as long as he has a motive. The difference is just that he is clearly unstable, and has exaggerated the details of the events in his tragic history.
Binarily augmented retroframing, or BARF. God, I gotta work on that acronym. Binarily augmented retroframing, or BARF.
And of course, we can't forget.
There is one standout visual sequence where Peter gets knocked around in a Mysterio acid trip, but it's seemingly all done in a computer. No practical effects. Nothing tangible for me to grab onto.
It's CGI in universe. It's literally a hologram. It's not supposed to look practical. I would actually use those words that it gives me nothing to grab onto as kind of a poetic way to describe how Peter feels in that scene. I think considering the fact that it isn't real in universe kind of allows us to emphasize with Peter as literally fighting smoke and mirrors. But no, we're upset that the canonically computer-generated creature was not practical. Okay, that about does it for the Far From Home video. I still have a lot of things I could say, and believe me, I'm not done with it in this video yet. But I don't want to drag things out too much, or I will make this video even more pointless. We've got one last video to talk about, so let's do it. The final video in this trilogy is the longest, clocking in at just under 17 minutes. It's also the most confusing, not in the what are you even saying kind of confusing that the Far From Home video was, but more just confusing. This video is, of course, about the most recent MCU Spider-Man movie and internet leak magnet, Spider-Man No Way Home. After I went and saw this movie myself, I was curious to see how HiTop would react to it, considering his history with both MCU Spider-Man and Raimi Spider-Man, and a weird little fling with Sony Spider-Man. Yeah, that's what I'm calling him. Sorry, Andrew. I guess I should have seen coming the confusing mess that is this video. The first note I had is that he admitted to getting drunk before the movie.
But I have to make a stop first. Josh, are you excited for No Way Home?
Kinda.
John, are you excited for No Way Home?
Yeah.
Which is a bold move, because you're admitting that the circumstances in which you viewed this movie were one where your judgment was hampered. Not a great look on your part, Alex. It's not a huge deal, but it is telling of his attitude going into this movie. The most interesting thing about this video to me, though, is that despite it being the longest, it's the one where he says the least. This video is very disjointed, and it feels like he put it together at the last minute, which is a shame. I may have just spent the last however many minutes just like harpooning the guy, but I do genuinely love how much effort Alex puts into the presentation of his videos. Like, he takes it very seriously. When looking at the actual points, I start to wonder if Alex and I had watched the same movie. He says that the first hour of No Way Home is the same as the other movies.
It's the first hour, the first half of Spider-Man No Way Home threw me into the darkest parts of hell with no way out. It's typical MCU Spider-Man, the style, the memes, the jokes, stuff that is simply in no way for me.
Which seems a little silly considering the huge shift in tone and the focus on consequences compared to the other two, which were a lot more lighthearted, especially Homecoming. He at one point makes the argument that Peter is unempathetic to the villains that show up.
Peter Parker, rather than have his mission based in empathy, would rather get rid of these villains, these victims, as soon as possible so he can focus on what's really important, getting his girlfriend and best friend into college.
And completely ignores the massive plot point of Peter fighting Dr. Friggin' Strange in order to save said villains, but whatever. He even does a repeat of one of his Homecoming arguments, saying that the sacrifice that Peter makes at the end of the movie doesn't have enough impact because the relationship between him and MJ isn't developed enough.
Pete's and MJ's entire relationship, Tom and Zendaya, they have great chemistry, but their love wasn't naturally established, naturally built. It wasn't about teenage idealization and then adulthood sacrifice.
Again, ignoring that he's not only sacrificing his relationship with MJ, he's also sacrificing his friendship with Ned, who we have seen their relationship be very developed, and erasing pretty much his entire identity from the world. He does have some points that I think do have validity about Aunt May's sacrifice possibly not being backed up by enough development in the past few movies, but there isn't a lot else there. And in my opinion, that doesn't take away from the actual scene in the movie. I wish I could talk more about the actual criticisms he makes of the movie's portrayal of Peter Parker, but to be honest, he doesn't make a whole lot more. He talks about the things that I've already addressed, makes some vague references to his previous videos, and spends a significant portion complaining about the cinematography for some reason.
I only wish the film didn't look like it was shot over a Zoom call or in Kevin Feige's basement. I get this was made during the time of a pandemic, but I found No Way Home to be 80% of the time hideously ugly with no tangible sense of space or reality.
Which, I guess you can dislike the cinematography, but you spent an awful amount of time on it in a video entitled How No Way Home Kinda Fixed MCU Spider-Man. He does seem satisfied with the ending, but throughout the video he was just determined to complain. And it almost feels like in the video that he's disappointed that he didn't dislike it more. Pretty much all of his prayers were answered, what with Raimi villains and Peter having his Uncle Ben moment, and pretty much resetting him to the state he is in the Raimi movies and in every other state that he's loved Spider-Man in, but it doesn't feel like anything about his opinion has actually substantially changed. I guess that's all I can really say about this video. It's confusing and doesn't really leave much of an impact besides that. Yeah, I just really don't know what else to say. Guess we should just go on to the last segment. Wow, call me Jimmy Heiselden, because look at that segue. I don't deserve to have a platform. Now that we've taken a closer look at each individual video, let's take a step back and view the bigger picture. First off, I want to address the little disclaimer that Alex has at the beginning of each video where he prefaces that it is just his opinion and or that he's biased. As I said, I like that. I like that he acknowledges his bias. It's good that he does that. But it's not something that protects him from criticism. Because after that, he presents the rest of the video as objective criticism for the most part. He says things about the movie that are misleading at best and objectively untrue at worst, interspersed with all of his actual opinions. Arguably, he has more of those than his opinions. My problem isn't with his conclusions about his opinions on this movie, it's how he presents his journey to those conclusions, which is usually incomplete. Going off that point, my main issue with the criticisms that he levies is that he leaves out details and or misconstrues plot points and events in order to make his argument. A notable example being his entire Far From Home argument of Peter has no relatable problems, which, as I said, is just not true. I could go through the other examples again, but my point still stands. It's almost like he preemptively comes up with his own conclusion and molds the movies into a shape where if you squint, it looks like the objective facts about those movies fit those conclusions. He didn't like Far From Home, so he added a bunch of half-truths into his review to legitimize his feelings. And I just can't stand for that. It's why I'm sitting down. He's free to dislike Far From Home. That is not my point. In fact, I encourage him. Dislike Far From Home. I hate it when people act like you can't dislike things or like things just because they don't. But I also hate it when people are intellectually dishonest about why they dislike those things. And it is pretty obvious why Alex doesn't like the MCU Spider-Man movies. It's the same reason he likes the Amazing Spider-Man movies more than he likes these ones. He's a huge fan of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy because he grew up with it and he has a lot of nostalgia for it. I am not knocking for that. I am not knocking him for that. I have very strong and positive feelings for pieces of media that I would defend to my dying breath. And I like the Sam Raimi movies. I do. I really do. I even like the third one, which I know for some reason people hate. I'm on your side on that point, Alex. But the problem is that with pretty much all of his main criticisms, he's hearkening back to those older movies, sometimes making direct comparisons. It's why he's so adamantly upset about the Uncle Ben thing. He's very defensive of those movies, as shown by how he reacts to other people's criticisms of it. Relating to the last point, this is a slight detour, but I want to compare his reactions to two different scenarios that both revolve around this topic. In 2019, the YouTuber JXC made a response to Alex's Far From Home video entitled How Not to Criticize Spider-Man Far From Home, a response to HiTop Films. Their video, while not wildly confrontational, was very directly critical of HiTop's opinions and video. While it was difficult to find a lot of the discussion following this video's release because Twitter's search system sucks, Twitter in general just sucks. It's why I don't have an account. But from what I can gather, Alex's reaction to this was pretty mild. And overall, he just didn't seem to engage with it all that much. In another instance, Marcus from the channel Cosmonaut Variety Hour, who is really his own can of worms when it comes to movie takes, released a video about the Raimi trilogy entitled Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, Worse Than You Remember. Despite the rather strong title, it was a pretty lighthearted critique of the movies. Marcus clearly likes them, he just saw them as flawed, which of course they are, but that doesn't mean that they're not good. HiTop didn't make a direct response to this, but he did reference it in his video on the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie.
So go ahead, pick this movie apart, make 30-minute videos talking about how this trilogy is worse than you remember. Rant about how cheesy they are, but that's bullshit, and you know it.
So, it's clear that Alex cares about these movies and that he will defend them more fervently than he will defend his own criticisms. Which I understand, I just think it's showing his hand and where his priorities are when it comes to this. I think Alex disliking the MCU Spider-Man movies is fine, like I said. But I also think that he should be willing to admit to himself that it's most likely because he's very attached to a specific portrayal of Spider-Man. Otherwise, he makes up problems to get mad at instead. And it's not like there aren't actual problems with these movies that he can criticize either. They're just usually not the focus of his videos. I do want to clarify that I respect Alex. He's someone who's made videos that have truly touched me in the past. And I truly do admire the passion that he has for these characters and the effort that he puts into his content. And hey, he's got 357,000 more subscribers than I do, so he's obviously doing something right. Alex, if you're watching this, I hope that you take this video in good faith. I know I got a little yelly at certain points. You don't have to follow my advice, but just know that I never meant any serious offense. I really hope that your career as a filmmaker works out, and I hope that Jason goes well. And for the rest of you, I want to sincerely thank you for watching. I think this is kind of a complex topic, not Spider-Man, but criticism in general. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on, because I love to hear people's input on this type of thing. I know that I've been really inconsistent with upload schedule recently, and I don't see that changing for a while. So I really appreciate those of you who are sticking with me. If you could share this video with someone, it would really help. Feel free to check out my socials and stuff. They're all linked in the description of this. Most of all, I hope that you have an excellent day, and that you know that there are people out there who care about you. All right, I'll see you all later. Bye.
I had hopes for Mysterio. I love myself some Jake.